Hello all my chess friends. Magnus Carlsen is out of control. In this video I have a game from his unbelievable performance in the Speed Chess Championship on chess.com in which he completely dominated the third highest rated chess player in history, Fabiano Caruana, scoring 18 wins out of 26 blitz games with 0 losses. The game I've chosen to review from this epic encounter is one in which you will see zero evidence that Magnus Carlsen is playing a blitz game. It looks like he is playing with a classical time control. He is not making mistakes. He is finding brilliant and decisive moves, and he is finding them quickly. This is Bobby Fischer level domination, my friends, and if you still think Magnus Carlsen is not the greatest player of all time, it might be a good time to reconsider your position. But enough said, this game will speak for itself, so sit back and enjoy. Magnus Carlsen begins the game with e4. Caruana plays e5. We have knight f3, and then knight to f6. The Petrov Defense, which has a reputation of being a rather drawish opening, though this may be a bit exaggerated because statistically speaking, it's not that bad if you want to play for a win as white. There are definitely opportunities to create imbalances, and Magnus Carlsen is going to give us a masterclass in how to do that. He plays the main line, knight takes e5, d6 from Caruana, all main line, knight to f3, and then black takes the pawn on e4, d4 putting a pawn in the center, black does the same. Now bishop d3, hitting the knight, preparing the castle. Here Caruana plays a move which is relatively uncommon, though it has been getting more popular in recent years, bishop to f5. Adding some defense to the knight, since a common idea for white in this opening is to play c4. If this knight had no protection, you could not take the pawn on c4, or there would be bishop takes knight. But here, d takes c4 would be possible, since the bishop is defending the knight. Carlsen castles, and Caruana prepares to do the same with the move bishop to e7. This is the best square for the bishop. You might think that bishop d6 looks a little more active, but after c4, black would like to take on c4, but will run into problems if he tries it here. After bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, rook to e1, pinning the bishop to the king. This would not be a pin if the bishop was on e7. So here this bishop cannot be moved, you have to defend, and then there's knight b to d2, hitting the bishop again, hitting this pawn on c4, not a good variation for black. Another point to putting the bishop on e7 instead of d6 is that it keeps this d6 square clear for the knight. Black wants to drop that knight back to d6, where it will be defending the bishop on f5. Carlsen plays rook to e1, we have castles, knight b to d2, hitting the knight on e4 with 3 pieces. Caruana plays the best move, knight to d6. Now black is threatening bishop takes d3, c takes d3, messing up the white pawn structure. So Carlsen responds to that threat by playing knight to f1, multi-purpose move. Now the queen can recapture on d3 instead of a pawn if black takes on d3. Also, we've opened up a diagonal for the dark squared bishop, and the knight is going to move to e3, improving its position, eyeing the undefended d5 pawn, hitting the bishop. So Caruana plays a good move, c6, adding defense to that pawn. It also opens up the c7 square. He's planning to develop his knight to a6, then to c7, then to e6. Carlsen plays bishop to f4, threatening to take the knight on d6, which will remove the defense of the bishop on f5. So Caruana addresses that threat by taking on d3, queen takes d3, and now knight to a6, with the plan of going to e6. You might think this isn't the best way to get the knight into the game because it takes 3 moves, but one of those moves, the move to e6, will come with an attack on the undefended bishop, which white will have to take a move to address, and having knights on d6 and e6 will control a lot of key squares. So this is probably a little better than the plan of knight d7 to f6, developing that way. The knights are a little more redundant, as you would say, since they're on the same color complex. You know, they're not hitting as many different squares, since they would only be controlling light squares. Compare that to having the 2 knights side by side, you're controlling light squares and dark squares. So Carlsen plays knight to e3, then we got knight c7, and at this point Carlsen makes an interesting decision. He takes the knight on d6, giving up his last remaining bishop for a knight. Why would he do this? Well, he knew that if he left the bishop on f4, knight to e6 would come with tempo, attacking the bishop, so he'd have to waste a move with the bishop, maybe go to g3 or something, you know, if he doesn't want to trade bishop for knight. Also, this knight is one of black's best pieces. Eyeing the e4 square, that's a nice square for a knight to hop into. And if the bishop were on g3, that knight would just be hitting the bishop now. And this knight on d6 is also controlling the f5 square. By eliminating that knight,
Carlsen could possibly play knight to f5. And that knight could not be taken anymore. It would come with an attack on the bishop on e7. So for those reasons, it's not a bad move. Bishop takes d6, bishop takes d6, and now Carlsen plays a bit of a novelty, which looks a little odd, g3, but it is logical. After knight e6, there won't be any knight to f4. This move g3 also supports a possible h4, h5 attack. Maybe the king will go to g2, rook here. And finally, it supports a possible knight to h4, defending the knight against queen takes h4, and now you'd have two knights converging on that nice f5 square. Caruana plays rook to e8, king g2 from Carlsen, just strengthening his position. Maybe it's a little bit of a waiting move, adding defense to a couple slightly weakened light squares. And here Caruana, apparently anticipating knight to f5, moves his bishop back to f8. He wants to keep his remaining bishop, but the computer doesn't like this move. It thinks that it would have been better to just play g6, stopping knight to f5 that way. This does weaken the dark squares around the black king, but black still has the dark squared bishop to help defend. Maybe at some moment bishop to f8 will be played, but it's not great here because after what was played in the game, bishop to f8, black has neglected the e5 square. No more control of that square with the bishop. And Carlsen continues with rook to e2. He's just looking to double his rooks. It's logical. The computer likes h4 a little bit better though. And unless black does something to stop it, the pawn will just keep marching forward, looking to induce some weakness around the black king. And if black were to try to stop that pawn with h5, you get knight to e5, which wouldn't have been possible if the bishop was on d6. Now if you try to kick that knight, now we go to this beautiful g6 square. It's not a good place to allow that white knight to post up. So this line with h4 was maybe a little better than what Carlsen played. Rook e2. Caruana plays knight to e6, rook a to e1 from Carlsen. Now Caruana offers a trade of knights with knight to g5, hitting some weak light squares. So Carlsen plays the best move and just takes him up on his offer. Knight takes g5, queen takes g5. And now h4 comes with tempo, hitting the queen. Queen drops back to g6. Carlsen could trade queens here, and it's not bad, but of course he wants more. So Carlsen blocks with knight to f5, opening up the file. So there's a threat of capturing on e8. So Caruana takes on e2, rook takes e2, and now Carlsen has the threat of knight e7 check. Bishop takes, the queen can take on g6, and after the pawn recaptures, we got rook takes e7, establishing a rook on the 7th rank, a well-known winning configuration for white. So Caruana adds defense to e7, so knight to e7 is not possible. Carlsen plays h5. Now he has the idea of playing knight to h4, keeping the knight on a forward post, which will free up the white queen to move somewhere instead of being tied down to defending the knight. Of course, this pawn is undefended for the moment, but black does not have a good way to win it. If you try queen g5, white can actually defend with rook to e5. Because if you take on h5, knight to e7 check will win the black queen. Caruana sees that and plays g6, kicking the knight off of f5. Carlsen plays the best move, knight to h4. Black still cannot capture on h5. If you were to try it, again there would be rook to e5, looking to pick up the pawn with the rook. If you try defending with the queen, then just queen to f3. Black king's looking pretty exposed, so that's bad for black. What Caruana plays is bishop to d6, preventing rook to e5, so that now g takes h5 is maybe a bit more playable. But Carlsen, he's still not worried about that pawn. He plays queen to e3. This is preventing queen to g5, which would attack the pawn further, but it does allow Caruana to take on h5 with the pawn, which turned out to be a mistake. He apparently overestimated his chances for counterplay with the move king to h8, planning rook to g8. But he should have played some waiting move and just maintained the status quo. Because after taking this pawn, we got queen d3 from Carlsen. He says, okay, I'm just going to get the queens off the board. I'm going to play queen f5, force a queen trade. Then your counterplay is not so important. And what is important is your weak pawn structure in my active king. King to h8 played. He's going for his rook g8 idea. Queen to f5. Now queen takes f5 is pretty much forced. Anything else would run him into problems. For example, if he took the pawn on d4, which is no longer protected, there'd be knight to f3, attacking the queen. You can take on b2, but now knight g5, hitting f7, threatening checkmate. That is not good, so maybe better would be queen g7 to defend. But now we get queen d7, hitting the bishop, hitting b7. White's getting too much activity. Black will not survive this. So queen takes f5 was necessary. Knight takes f5, hitting the bishop. We got bishop f8. And now here comes the king, going after the h-pawn. So if we stop here and assess the position, we see that white has a beautifully placed knight, full control of the only open file, which black does not have a good way to contest anytime soon. This pawn is going to fall, and he'll still have these split pawns. White has a healthy pawn structure. Caruana's best chance at this point would have been to play king g8, and after king h4, play f6, looking to get the king into the game via f7, but instead he goes for a5. Looking for a4, possibly a3, trying to create some play for this rook. This plan does not work out. Carlsen plays king to h4. We got a4. He takes the pawn. If Caruana were to keep pushing with a3, he just played b3, shut down that file. So Caruana plays king g8 now, but it's a little too late to play f6 and king to f7 because Magnus Carlsen immediately plays king to g5. No f6 for you. So at this point, Caruana, in a desperate bid for some counterplay, plays c5. It's a losing move, but can't be criticized too harshly since all of his moves were losing moves at this point. If you were to make some less active move, like let's say rook to d8, the white king would come to f6, and let's say you make some other passing move. Knight to e7 check could be played. If the king moves, you're losing your f-pawn, but then if the bishop takes, you got rook takes e7, hitting 2 pawns. So waiting moves are not working for black. It's probably a good practical decision to try to get some activity. c5. Carlsen just takes out that pawn, allowing Caruana to get his bishop to a nice square, but unfortunately this has left Caruana's d-pawn weak, and Carlsen immediately targets it with rook to d2. Rook d8 defends, Carlsen plays c3, preventing the pawn from going forward. King to f8 played, black really doesn't have anything better here. Now Carlsen plays a strengthening move, f4. It controls the central square.
There's also a subtle defensive idea to this move that could come into play if black played a3. B takes a3, bishop takes a3. c4 would win a pawn here for white. This pawn's pinned, it can't capture, or you lose the rook. But here, if f4 hadn't been played, there'd be bishop c1, pinning the rook to the king. So f4 is useful in that line.
Rook to d7 played by Caruana. Now Carlsen moves his king to g4. I'm not entirely sure what the thinking is here. It gets the king off of a dark square, in case at some moment there would be a check from the bishop. But I believe that instead of king g4, Carlsen could have played what he played on his next move after Caruana plays f6, going for king f7. Carlsen plays a very strong move, and not an obvious one, b4. And anywhere this bishop moves is going to be detrimental to black's position. If you were to take on b3 en passant, a takes b3, and b4 will just be coming anyway. So Caruana decides to put the bishop to b6, presumably so that he can control the d4 square. But this unfortunately allows the move c4. If the bishop had stayed on this diagonal, then bishop takes b4 could be played here. So this wouldn't be as good for white. This pawn is attacked now by 2 pieces, defended only by 1, and is pinned. If you take the pawn, you're losing your rook, of course. Caruana pushes the pawn forward. Alright, it's defended by 2 pieces, attacked by 2 pieces, but that's short-lived because here Carlsen has c5. Eliminating the defense of d4 by the bishop, which must move. Caruana plays bishop c7 and we get rook takes d4. Carlsen is now a pawn up, but much more significant than that are the threats he has coming. For the moment, he's threatening to take the rook, so Caruana defends with king e8. After Carlsen's move b5, Caruana resigns. This move opens up an attack on the a4 pawn. Caruana doesn't have a great defense besides taking the rook, and Carlsen is very close to creating a passed pawn. If rook takes rook, knight takes rook. You can try to defend with the king, but now white can target this pawn, and then if you move the king back, there's going to be b6. These pawns and the knight versus this pawn and the bishop will result in white getting a queen. You're going to see how that works in a second. Let's say instead of king e7, you try to defend with the bishop. Well, here we got c6 check. Play takes with check. King's got to move. Now you got knight e6 hitting the bishop. If you try to keep defending f6, well, now you got c7. King defends. And here black's all tied up. The black king has to stay here and babysit the c-pawn so it doesn't turn into a queen.
The winning technique for white will involve transferring the king over to the queen side, and black will not be able to both stop white's advanced c-pawn and avoid getting checkmated. So here's an example of how it could play out. The white king goes to c6, and then there's checkmate threats with the knight, since the black king has nowhere to go.
So a hopeless position to try to defend. If you were to move the other direction with the king, going to f7 to defend this pawn, white can win very quickly with b6. And once the bishop moves, there's c6, threatening to take on b7. So if you take that pawn on c6, there's b7, threatening to get a queen. If you defend with bishop c7, now there's knight takes c6, supporting that square. So black is going to have to sacrifice his bishop for that pawn. Similar thing happens if you were to take on b6 right here with the bishop. Then there's c takes b7, bishop c7. Same thing, knight c6. And black is finished. So thank you for letting me take you through yet another incredible performance by Magnus Carlsen. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing to the channel to experience more of it very soon.